Okay, today we're going to draw on the insights of the great Harvard psychologist William James to discuss the dire psychological consequences of easy religion, or the consequences of idealism. There is such a thing as a privileged theology, an easy theology, an idealistic theology that can't become compatible categorically with real life. And I saw this a lot when I was studying for my master's and my doctorate in theology. And I'm going to try to talk about this in a way that remains as unsanctimonious as possible. And this is an activity, this privileged theology, this not real life theology. This is an activity that we can indulge in when life doesn't have its boot on our neck, when you're at the front of the classroom behind a podium, when you're dealing with the books and the texts and the ideas. But this is categorically different from the theology we need to utilize to engage the difficulties of real life, which for many people is the reason that they begin studying theology in the first place. This privileged theology is something that we do when life isn't pressing us to renounce God, to renounce virtue, to renounce our principles. This is something we do when our internal demons and our external circumstances aren't sending us these daily memos. Curse God and die. Curse God and die. Curse God and die. And some people just never receive these memos due to life, due to their personalities. These religious ideas like divine sovereignty and salvation, they have this immediate practical import for many people psychologically. And these concepts, they just snatch people out of the pit of emotional despair. Like the eagles from Lord of the Rings. They're demons. They just get pushed off a cliff. These ideas bring people to emotional safety, to an existential place of security. The infamous Harvard psychologist William James, he called these people healthy-minded people. Now, these healthy-minded people, these are people to whom religion comes easy. They've never had an existential compulsion to run a security check on their faith, to authenticate God's background check. But James distinguishes between two kinds of healthy-mindedness, okay? Involuntary healthy-mindedness and voluntary healthy-mindedness. In church, involuntary healthy-mindedness is the pathetically incompetent naivete that is so uselessly blind to evil that it can hardly face real life. James explains it this way, okay? He says to this about, he's here describing the man who is an involuntarily healthy-minded person. He says, to the man actively happy, for whatever cause, evil simply cannot then and there be believed in. He must ignore it. And to the bystander, he may then seem perversely to shut his eyes to it and to hush it up. But more than this, the hushing of it up may grow into a deliberate religious policy. James is here explaining this psychological phenomenon that has codified itself into the informal rules of Christian conduct at a culturally subatomic level. Okay? This religious policy of hushing up evil for the sake of maintaining a nice picture, an idealist theology, one in which God can be straightforwardly explained to be in the right in every circumstance. The evangelical compulsion to treat the existence of tragedy and evil as something that can be explained and justified and compensated for, or moved past, or expedited, or rectified with theology is identical to what James is calling here this involuntary healthy-mindedness. Now, there are two reasons that this informal agreement between evangelical practice and involuntary healthy-mindedness might seem good to evangelicals. Now, first, is this. Involuntary healthy-mindedness helps you simply to skate past evil. It allows you to classify it and categorize it and justify it, and to move past evil and suffering as quickly as possible. For people with a certain psychological disposition, supplies a feeling of having sufficiently dealt with it at a philosophical level. They substitute the feeling of resolution for the fact of resolution. Second, it allows those who are insecure about the integrity of their faith to draw a full circle around God and evil so that they don't have to make eye contact with theological paradox and mystery. The payoff is that the task of defending the Christian belief system against accusations of irrationality and perhaps against internal suspicions of irrationality becomes easier. But the risk of glossing over disruptive facts for agreeable fiction becomes greater. Now, this amalgamation of evangelicalism and involuntary healthy-mindedness yields several undesirable results. First, people who are in the throes of grief will either suppress that grief for the sake of cultural assimilation in a culture that incentivizes involuntary healthy-mindedness, or they will resent and leave the culture that sets them on a certain expectation for resolving their grief within a certain time frame. Second, the theological system becomes unaccountable to personal autobiography, which puts the conceptual framework at risk of becoming philosophical and practical idealism. Now, what this means is that Christianity, at its best, at its very best, exists at the point of contact between its ideas and the lived human life of the Christian. And to the degree that Christian theology cannot tolerate the natural quagmires and processes of human life, to the degree that it requires us to pretend that they simply don't exist or are not really a problem, then Christianity becomes more a religion appropriate for robots than human beings. And at best, it will become a religion that works very well for people of a certain psychological persuasion and work very terribly for others. Third, involuntary healthy-mindedness incentivizes people to avoid spiritual crisis and therefore to repair conceptual inequities in their system before those inequities have had a chance to properly affect and embed within their autobiography. So, in other words, it dissolves the role of theological mystery in faith. What I mean basically is that, paradox and contradiction and cracks in the foundation of religious belief produces problems for people in their believing that in their solving catalyze a process of psychologically integrating new layers of profundity into their system of belief. Stated more briefly, it deepens their faith. And the problem for evangelicalism is that they have become so efficient at solving these problems for people conceptually that they have disallowed them from processing them personally. And that these new layers of profundity, these new depths of personalized faith, for those who actually take that step and go on that journey, they may not play well with the involuntary healthy-mindedness of the culture. And personal crisis may even take many on a journey outside the boundary lines, of so-called confessional Christianity. And the evangelical impulse is to say, no, you can't go there. You cannot go there. You cannot go outside this line. You can't cross this line. You can't do it. Not allowed to do it. But for some people, their crises beckon them there. And they may not even... Some people need to draw outside the lines of Christian orthodoxy, not because they're leaving the faith forever, although that certainly is an option, but simply to go there, simply to explore, simply to get some space somewhere from a faith that feels toxic to them because the problem of evil has impressed itself upon them, or the problem of contradiction within their faith has impressed itself upon their mind and upon their soul. And so, again, this third undesirable result of the harmony between evangelicalism and involuntary healthy-mindedness is that it disincentivizes the necessary processes by which theology is personalized for individuals in crisis and through crisis. But there is a dark side to the unhealthy mind. And James actually makes a point of this, because it is where most who engage Christian belief with intellectual honesty find themselves. Okay, involuntary healthy-mindedness is not ideal, but involuntary unhealthy-mindedness can be just as bad, if not worse. So James explains it this way. Ready? James says, the attitude of unhappiness, he's explaining involuntary unhealthy-mindedness here, okay? The attitude of unhappiness is not only painful, it is mean and ugly. What can be more base and unworthy than the pining, puling, mumping mood, no matter by what outward ills it may have been engendered? What is more injurious to others? What less helpful as a way out of difficulty? It but fastens and perpetuates the trouble which occasioned it, and increases the total evil of the situation. At all costs, then, we ought to reduce the sway of that mood. We ought to scout it out in ourselves and never show it tolerance. Okay, so James is actually expressing here, as a psychologist, a distaste for involuntary unhealthy-mindedness, even more than his distaste for involuntary healthy-mindedness. And so it's really easy to look at the involuntary healthy-minded and say, your hollow, wide-eyed, simple-minded, superficial belief system is a convenient blinder for you, and it's a jail cell for all those people who don't actually fit into your system and who want to recognize the fact that evil exists and whose faith has been disrupted. Okay, it's easy to make that criticism of the involuntary healthy-minded. It's true that there are people who are so dispositionally blind to evil that they become useful for, formalities and ceremonies of the faith, but not much more. Okay, that's the involuntary healthy-minded. And on the other hand, what is, I think, probably far more common in our cultural moment is a dispositional blindness toward the good. How often have you been broken by life, beaten, dragged through the mud, tortured, drowned in guilt, numb with despair, medicating your disillusionment with alcohol and pornography and food? James says that we are, most of us, psychologically stuck in that gear, unable to shift into action, out of darkness, into seeing positively. All we see is bad. All we see are bad intentions and bad luck and bad odds barreling at us at supersonic speed. We live our lives with a grimace, expecting the worst, with a clenched jaw, with this anxious expectance of malevolence and misfortune and oppression. And James says that the only way to find a positive ideal, which is bigger than ourselves, and to orient all our efforts toward attaining it, this is the solution between involuntary healthy-mindedness and involuntary unhealthy-mindedness. We have to find a positive ideal, which is bigger than us, toward which we orient ourselves. And we might scoff at that. It feels like a request made by somebody who is blinded by involuntary healthy-mindedness. But we have to remember, James is not an idealist. He's not an evangelical. He's a pragmatist and he's a psychologist. And we have to listen to him on those terms. We have to trust that those are his values. Those are his methods. He insists that we need to find some worthwhile ideal bigger than ourselves, not because some doctrine or dogma or church body dictates that we find one. No. We have to find this ideal toward which to orient our entire lives, because the psychological cost of failing to do so will have such a devastating and extensive and protracted negative effect on our lives and the lives of our loved ones that we owe it to ourselves and to our families and to the ideal itself to find it. James uses the example of a patriot who gladly faces the cruelest suffering of imprisonment and death and even torture for the sake of protecting liberty. The patriot, he might be brave, but better than being brave is having a worthwhile ideal which calls us to fight and being brave for that ideal. That's worthy bravery. It's not foolhardy. It's not selfish. It's worthwhile. James, he's another example of a lover. It's kind of sort of a less serious example of a lover who's willing to kind of break the rules and suffer the consequences for the sake of love, right? Guy climbs up a dormitory wall, gets caught by the security guard just to give his girlfriend a goodnight kiss, right? Worth it. He's found an ideal. He's oriented his actions toward it. He's willing to suffer the consequences gladly. It makes sense of suffering, and it gives them a purpose. This is what James calls not involuntary healthy-mindedness or involuntary unhealthy-mindedness, but voluntary healthy-mindedness. This is the healthy-mindedness which can see evil and appreciate its devastation, but make every effort to make as much good as possible out of that bad situation. This is a perspective which compels people who have been stripped of their idealism, what really matters to you, because that will determine how you act when tragedy takes everything from you. And James says that we need to cultivate this healthy mindedness, not as idealists who pretend to practice what they preach, who pretend that their ideal serves them psychologically in some way, but as pragmatists who search not for ideals that incentivize us to pretend that they work when they don't, but as pragmatists who are looking for ideals which have for us real existential utility without negating real tragedy. And it's important to note that the point James makes here, it doesn't require people who go through a crisis of faith to abandon Christianity for a utilitarian nihilism. He's not saying, well, the involuntarily healthy-minded people, well, they have Christianity, so we need to find something else. No. What James is saying here can apply as a modality for Christianity, as a modality for Christian psychology. James points out that this sort of nihilistic tactical atheism, for which most people leave Christianity when they become disillusioned with its culture, usually produces shallow self-help philosophies that are just secular versions of the involuntary healthy-mindedness people were trying to escape from in the first place, okay? So you can be culturally evangelical while being an open atheist, because the fact is, whether you're healthy-minded or you're unhealthy-minded, the pejorative aspect or the negative aspect or the unhelpful aspect of those postures is the involuntary nature that they have, that they contain. So James isn't looking to dissuade people from Christian truths, but we can see and we can use James's model here as a way of getting unstuck from a climate of practices that disallows those in crisis from putting their faith and their life into contact and allowing them to mutually correct one another. So instead, faith functions like a philosophical steamroller, like idealism, and Christianity functionally becomes an idea rather than a reality. And what James proposes is a psychological suggestion that evangelicalism needs to take. And it is this: there is a large gap between what's true and what works. And we don't know where that gap comes from. Part of it is the diversity of human psychology. Part of it is the necessity of religious ideas to become internalized to each individual in a way that's personalized to their autobiography. Whatever are the multitude of reasons, the fact remains that truth, and especially religious truth, which has a tendency to become abstract and tyrannical toward personal autobiography, truth needs to undergo a process of becoming practical in order for it to become truly useful. And the more useful we can make it, the more its truthfulness can become publicly and privately evident to us. So it must go through the journey of growing from its seed form as a philosophical idea into a tree of personal anecdote. And this growth requires that the religious idea and personal autobiography are always mutually correcting one another. They're always in conversation. Neither one is steamrolling the other. If religion becomes tyrannical, and this can become involuntary healthy-mindedness or pop spiritual self-help crap or whatever. If personal autobiography becomes tyrannical in the conversation, then this can become an involuntary unhealthy-mindedness with which we're all too aware, where our negative ideas dominate us. Our negative ideas might even turn into a religion like Puritanism. And we have to be cultivating a middling idea between real life and the religious idea that is grounded in the utility of daily personal practice, but is accountable to a greater ultimate ideal, something that's not just the ideal that is God, and something that's not just the ideal is the ideal of my personal experience right now in this moment, something in between God and my personal experience right now. What is that? What binds them in order to drive me to find the best and to make meaning out of suffering and evil and malevolence in my life right now? Is it family? Is it virtue? Is it building something? What is that middling idea that's higher than me, but more utile than the idea of God? And this middling idea is the reality to which you psychologically strive, that is both compelling philosophically and has psychological tactility and motivation. It matters to you for reasons other than its own sake. The point of an ideal isn't just to believe it so that you can believe it. The point of the ideal is that it compels you. And you have to find out what that is. And if you can find this middling idea, then you navigate the waters between these two impractical, involuntary mindsets. Your life depends on it.